When I was growing up, conservatism was all around me. Most of the adults I knew were conservatives. However, I didn't have a very positive opinion of conservatism because it meant to me intolerance, censorship, patriotism, and war. As I grew up, I found that I actually shared quite a bit with conservatives. But I also detected a few really strange turns of thought in conservative philosophy, and one of those was a distrust of reason. Do you trust reason or do you practice reason? That was sort of my attitude, but conservatives often ply this argument that reason is untrustworthy. And for that reason, my colleague in LocoFocoism, Waaks, has invited Robert Tracinski to talk to us about reason and conservatism in the age of Trump, but from a philosophical perspective. And that's probably important. I've not read the articles that Mr. Waaks has read. I'm afraid I'm a little slow here. I've been busy. But I did read an interesting article by Mr. Tracinski from last year about how the Democrats appear to be helping Trump, not helping themselves.
The Democrats' version of creep.
Yes, that was very good.
Oh, yeah, that one, yes. Or being reelected by the Democrats, or they're doing their best. I think they're doing a little less well now because they nominated Joe Biden, who is a fairly weak candidate, but he's less repulsive than most of the others on offer.
He's a dreaded neoliberal.
Correct.
And I also just bought, I don't know if you can see this, I just bought a book.
First rule of going on podcasts, always have your book handy to show people the cover. It's on Amazon, available there. So Who is John Galt Anyway is the title.
Can you give a pressy, who is John Galt anyway?
Well, I don't want to give away. I actually, so this is a series of essays on Ayn Rand's novel Atlas Shrugged, which has that famous tagline, "Who is John Galt?" I don't want to give away too much because you'll see that if you've read the introduction, I've got a sort of robust spoiler warning for people who haven't read the novel yet. But it's because I give away a lot of spoilers in the book. It's analysis of the novel. It talks about the philosophical issues, the literary aspects of it. It talks about the historical.
I should
context.
warn you that neither Lee nor I
Atlas Shrugged is a work of science fiction and how it fits in with other works of science fiction. Atlas and Ayn Rand as a philosopher of the Enlightenment, which ties into some of the things we're going to be talking about today.
I should warn you that neither Lee or I have read Atlas Shrugged.
Well, now is your opportunity. Now is your time.
I may very well take up the opportunity soon, though. If you saw my book stacks near the bed and near the computer, everywhere, they're pretty high. I have read The Fountainhead, and I thought it was very good, by the way. I think that the Gail Winan sequence may be one of the best tragedies written in modern times.
It certainly is, and if my chapter 3. I think it's chapter 3 is called "Did Dominique Franken Win?" And it's sort of a comparison of Atlas Shrugged to The Fountainhead, so you'll find that interesting.
Well, I'm glad you're here for LocoFoco, our LocoFoco Netcast. We'll see how it goes here. Lee is going to be asking most of the questions to start with, I think. Lee's a more organized person than I am sometimes, so he's actually done some pre-work. So why don't we tip it off to Lee?
I'm not as organized as I wanted to be, because I had a little disruption, but we're not going to go into that. But the reason why I contacted Mr. Tracinski is because I discovered 2 of his essays online. One of them is "The Enlightenment Ideal of Reason Has Absolutely Vindicated Itself." And the other is "Dear Conservatives, the Enlightenment is Not the Enemy." I think both of these essays have similar themes, and I'm sure Mr. Tracinski is aware that traditional conservatism is, I think, trying to make a comeback, right?
Yes.
Of sorts, because usually conservatives are associated with the classical liberal heritage, more in the vein of Ayn Rand and Ludwig von Mises, Hayek, and so forth. But now we have people like Yoram Hazony talking about nationalism or trying to bring about a resurgence of nationalism. And then there's an author by the name of Michael Deneen. No, is it Michael? No, Deneen. Patrick Deneen, sorry. Yeah, he's another one. He's come up with this idea of the paradox that liberalism has failed because it has succeeded, which is interesting. I don't buy into that paradox. Anyway, I thought you could discuss those 2 articles and maybe some of the conservative authors that you've encountered either in books or online, and go ahead and make a defense of your thesis there.
Well, this is actually something I'm spending a lot of time getting up to speed on now. My next book project is a defense of the autonomous individual. So if you read a lot of these, I'm calling them nationalist conservatives for because that seems to be the term they're drifting towards. And if you look at these nationalist conservatives, the theme that keeps coming up is the problem is the idea of the autonomous individual, and that's what's bad. That's the source of all the problems. And of course, as a guy who just wrote a book about Ayn Rand, I am a defender of the autonomous individual, right? So that's the idea. So I'm getting up to speed on this and getting an idea of what their philosophical issues are. And there's something you just said that isn't exactly right. You said traditional conservatism is trying to make a comeback. This is a little different from what conservatism has been, at least for a long time in America. So what we have is what would sort of probably count as traditional conservatism right now. So you talked about these articles I wrote about the Enlightenment. That was during a year, I think it was 2018, when you had Steven Pinker had a book out on the Enlightenment, and Jonah Goldberg, who's a conservative, had a book out on the Enlightenment. And Jonah Goldberg represents sort of so I, of course, use it as an opportunity to write lots of stuff about the Enlightenment because it's a favorite topic. It's a good opportunity to talk about something that's near and dear to my heart. But Jonah Goldberg is an example of a sort of classic late 20th century conservative, and that would be traditional conservatism in our current context. And that was what was called fusionism. And it was the idea of we're going to take religious belief and a belief in God, and we're going to fuse that with classical liberalism and Ludwig von Mises and the pro-free market economists and a little bit of Ayn Rand and American individualism. And we're going to combine that all together. And then, I think the other part of the fusion was we're going to have the hawks, the Cold War hawks, the people who want to be strong against the Soviet Union. And for a little while, that was the people who want to be strong against radical Islam. That aspect, the foreign policy aspect, has fallen out. But what happened was that the way this was sold is that the traditional conservatives we're advocates of liberty. We're advocates of liberty and freedom and the American system. Freedom with a trademark is practically, one of the rallying cries of late 20th century conservatism. And our belief in religion, they said, is reinforcing that. It's providing the foundation for it. And their argument was you can't have freedom without a moral foundation, and the moral foundation and the philosophical foundation is provided by religion, by traditional Christianity. And they had all these arguments to show that. And First Things, for example, which has been a center of this new nationalist conservatism, it's a Catholic conservative magazine. It was originally formed as sort of an organ of this somewhat fusionist approach of having a more liberal and this is liberal in the correct sense of the word, meaning pro-freedom, a more pro-freedom classical liberal philosophy combined with traditional Catholicism. Now, what we're finding now, and as somebody, again, as an Ayn Rand fan, I'm finding that she was warning us about this back in the 1950s, is they don't combine very well. And the thing that you'll get coming out of Yoram Hazony, who's actually he's Jewish, so he's coming from the Hebrew, the Judeo part of the Judeo-Christian background, but you'll get it from Patrick Deneen, you'll get it from First Things and from the Catholics, is that all along what this was really about is that they were hoping that by having that fusion of combining religion with the other aspects of conservatism, it would save and preserve religion and the central role of religion in American life. And what they're seeing really in the last is, if you look at the public opinion polls where they ask people, what's your religious affiliation? The last 30 years, it's falling off a cliff. The number of people who have no religious affiliation, who are outright atheists, have gone from, as an atheist, lifelong atheist, it used to be we're 3-5% of people out there. It's going up to more like 10 or 15% who will actually come out and say, I don't believe in God. And of people who are agnostic or religiously unaffiliated, it's becoming one of the largest denominations out there. It's above 15%. The traditional Catholicism is cratering down. Of course, it has many of its own problems. recent scandals and things like that are contributing to that. And so what they're seeing is religious belief is disappearing in American life. And our alliance with classical liberalism was supposed to sort of be mutually beneficial. Classical liberalism was supposed to benefit, and religion was supposed to benefit. Now that's not happening. Classical liberalism has benefited, they think, not as much as they think, but they think classical liberalism became part of the agenda of the Republican Party, tax cuts and deregulation and that sort of thing. So they got part of their agenda, but now our part, the religious belief, is cratering, it's disappearing. And so they've said, basically, if it won't preserve traditional religion, if it won't act to keep traditional religion at its central role in the public square and in American life, then liberalism is no good. It's not working. It has failed. And that's what they really mean when they say liberalism has failed. What they mean is it has failed to keep us and our religious viewpoint at the center of American life.
Right. Go ahead, Timo.
I just want to mention we're having a pretty bad Skype connection. So this is going to be not the most pristine recording that we would hope for. What I've noticed is that they seem to waffle between classical liberalism and modern progressive liberalism. They're basically blame classical liberalism for all the errors of modern progressive liberalism. It's over and over again. It's a Zoni character does it all over the place, it seems like.
Yeah, they basically say that it goes straight from John Locke to today, and nothing else philosophically happened in between. And this is, basically their idea is to ignore, John Stuart Mill. I think John Stuart Mill really is the dividing point. That if you want to look at what is been called liberalism in the 20th century, what we think of as liberalism, which is this combination of, we're going to regulate the economy, we're going to have all sorts of, we're going to have big government, but then we're also going to have free speech, and you're going to be able to smoke weed, and you're going to be able to live with a woman who is not your wife, all that sort of thing. That traditional 20th century combination, we're going to have the social liberalism along with government control of the economy. That goes back to John Stuart Mill. He's the one who sort of broke those things apart, and he did it in a number of ways. But the big thing is, he was the one who said the social freedoms and the ability to have what I think he called it experiments in living, which is this sort of proto-hippie-ish. This guy was very straight-laced, but he had this sort of proto-hippie-ish ideal of experiments in living. And that was a moral imperative, that not forcing people to do to follow your morality, not forcing people's conscience, that is an absolute moral prohibition. You can never breach it. Economic freedom, he said, is a little different. It's more of a practical concern. And of course, being raised by James Mill, one of the great classical economists, he was a pro-free marketer, except he slipped on that a little later. And so as he was too well taught about the virtues of the free market. So he said, well, that's a practical consideration. But in practical terms, we need to have the free market. And then what happened is, as Marxism comes along and Keynesianism comes along, you get this series of rationalizations to say, well, if it's only a practical concern to have the free market, here's all these practical arguments, all these economic arguments for why, well, the free market is really exploitative and you need government to counterbalance it and to spend money and to help the poor, etc. And that's how you get this bifurcation. But also the other thing that Mill introduced, and by the way, if you want to talk about this, I've got an old friend named Robert Garmong. I did an interview with him a while back. He's written some interesting things about Mill. It's sort of his expertise. And one of the other things that Mill brought in is the idea that your disapproval of my lifestyle and of my outre behavior and experience for living, your disapproval is itself a form of oppression. He sort of played around with and pioneered that idea. And of course, that became the central idea of modern progressive. They didn't even call themselves liberals anymore. Modern progressivism, the central idea came to be that if you don't positively approve of and endorse my alternative lifestyle choice or my chosen pronouns or whatever else, therefore then you are oppressing me because you're depriving me of the support of society, which is what I need to survive. But I think the big thing is that liberalism came from being, at the time of Locke, a form of individualism, and then by the 20th century came to describe a form of collectivism. These are absolutely the opposite, and that's why I think it's hilarious that these nationalist conservatives keep talking about how their enemy is this ideal of the autonomous individual. It has 150 years since the left represented the ideal of the autonomous individual. They are collectivists in their underlying philosophy to some extent or another. And then, your arm has on. I just read one of the articles you were talking about. Says, his belief is the fundamental unit of society is a national collective. So this is one collectivist arguing against another collectivist, and as usual, trying to pretend the individualists don't exist as an option.
Right. But they like to make a distinction, though. Here's an example. I have a conservative friend, and when I point out the differences, the stark differences, at least to me, between, say, the Soviet Union and the United States, although, you can always find superficial parallels, of course. We have nuclear weapons, they had nuclear weapons, etc. You can
they
create
had
these
shortages
parallels.
of toilet paper. We have shortages of toilet paper.
Exactly, right.
Actually, I just slight diversion, but during this whole coronavirus thing when the shelves were empty, I had a friend who sent me on eBay. Apparently, you can buy a pristine roll of Soviet toilet paper from 1977 for like $17 a roll or something like that. And I thought it's an interesting museum piece, but it actually seemed practical for a moment there.
They're not so interested in these differences between the Soviet Union or socialism and capitalism, because for them, they're both materialistic philosophies. It's all about growth, and for the socialists even, individual autonomy. Ironically, like within this collectivist framework, they're trying to liberate themselves so they can live a free life, trying to eliminate scarcity. I'm sure you recall that quote from Karl Marx. I can't repeat it off the top of my head about fishing in the
being
morning
a critic
and
in the afternoon.
Right.
Fishing in the morning, a herdsman in the midday, and a critic in the afternoon, or something like that. Yeah.
Exactly. So even like within like socialism, there's that tension between collectivism and individual autonomy, but they're trying to use collectivism in a sense to liberate themselves. We can get into a lot of details there. If the idea was that the economy would basically run itself, that it was just, in Lenin's words, just an issue of bookkeeping, and we're just eliminating scarcity, then yes, we can focus on the individual. But going back to what conservatives are saying, even though they may have a collectivist enterprise in mind, to their way of thinking, it's very different, because they're not pursuing materialism and individualism for the sake of individualism, like art for art's sake. They're more focused on the family and ensuring that the family is successful, and that would include the head of the household being successful economically. So it ties in with nationalism, hence the collectivist enterprise. You want to make sure that people can provide for themselves. The primary breadwinner if the woman is staying at home, which would be a traditional approach. And so they're not interested in the liberationist aspects, even though they may have collectivist aspirations at one level or another, but they see themselves being very different from liberals and socialists and so forth. Can you address that aspect?
Well, I think it's curious that historically most political ideologies have pretended to be liberal in some way. That they're always about, that freedom is so fundamental a value in human life that very few people will be openly against it. They try to appropriate it and say, well, we're for a fuller kind of freedom. We're for a freedom, that can only be possible once we've imposed all these controls, right? And there's always that contradiction, and that Marx quote is perfect example of that. And it's like his idea of the state will wither away. Once we totally control everything, then you will be completely free. And that's what, of course, Orwell was mocking in a way with the freedom is slavery, that they've redefined freedom in such a way that by and actually philosophically you'll see that they do this. This is the Hegelian idea that's within Marxism and a lot of the other and within fascism, which is the idea that by experiencing your true identity as a unit of the larger collective, then you will be truly free to express your real self. And your real self is that you're a cell of the collective superorganism. And that's how liberalism came to be the name for the American left, is they wanted to sort of steal the moral high ground of being pro-freedom, despite the fact that their agenda was, total control of the economy. But they were pro. And the interesting thing is all this criticism of the liberals as being materialistic. The old liberals were not materialistic, or at least they claimed not to be materialistic. They said, we're going to control everything in the material realm, but the spirit we're going to allow to be free, man. Freewheeling across the universe, man. Because it's a sort of hippie ideal that we're going to be free spirits, and there's going to be no controls on us intellectually. And that's what I think is interesting, though, is that the modern nationalist conservatives are really dropping, for the first time in a long time, they're dropping the pretense of freedom being an important value. They still keep it in there. They say, oh, well, we want to preserve freedom. We think it's important, but we want to just preserve it within its proper limits. But they're pretty expansive about what those limits are. And the main thing is that they drop freedom from being at the top level of their ideals. And sort of gets downgraded to, yes, we'll have some toleration of opposing viewpoints, but we're dropping that as a central feature of our ideology. And that's what makes it it makes it frightening on the one hand, and also a little difficult to deal with, because most other ideologies that, we spent the 20th century arguing really since World War II, when fascism and communism were sort of discredited, especially fascism, totalitarianism was discredited in World War II. Since then, the idea of simply identifying an ideology as being anti-freedom in some big way has been taken as a discrediting characteristic, right? And so you can say, oh, you people are against freedom. You're able to shoot them down, and they'll say, yes, we're against freedom. And then it sort of throws us back on our resources. And I think that's in a way a good thing, because if you look at the current state of the left and the right, what you'll see is that the ideological defense of freedom has been sort of allowed to wither. There hasn't been a really strong attempt to define, well, what is freedom? What is liberalism? What are the first principles that we can establish that we're moving from? That debate has sort of withered away to a large extent, I think, especially on the right. So the nationalist conservatives coming in, they're basically what's what Hitler said about attacking Russia: kick down the door and the whole rotten structure will collapse. That's sort of what they're doing to traditional conservatism. They realize that traditional conservatism's weak spot is that it does have this contradiction of wanting to have freedom be part of an agenda that also includes this central dominant role for religion. And by asserting that central dominant role of religion, they know that traditional conservatives haven't spent the time creating and developing and thinking deeply about the basis of freedom. And so I think they see that sort of as a weak spot. And I see that with, I was following the debates between Sohrab Ahmari, who's one of these writers at First Things, who's been a spokesman for the nationalist conservatives, and David French, who's sort of a classical liberal, but also an evangelical Christian. And I know David French, I like David French, but I think Sohrab Ahmari sort of picked his opponent well in taking on David French, because David French has all these weak spots that are created from the fact that he is an evangelical Christian. And he actually believes that, yes, religion should be central to everything. And so he makes little concessions to the nationalist conservative outlook because he can't do otherwise given his religious premises. So I think that this showdown between religious belief and freedom that's been sort of put off for 50, 60 years by the fusionist ideas of National Review, O.M.F. Buckley, and First Things, that showdown is now coming to the forefront. As I think it has to, because if a pro-freedom outlook, and free markets in particular, are going to be tied to religious belief, and religious belief is cratering, well, we better find some other philosophical foundation for freedom, because, and that's the interesting contradiction of the nationalist conservatives, is they say, we are going to reject liberalism so that we can rule and we can dominate in the public square. But their whole premise to begin with is our viewpoint is fading from losing people's loyalty. We're becoming irrelevant. We're becoming a small and despised minority. So therefore, let's seize power. It's probably not going to work out that way. So I think this is an opportunity to have to return to some of these fundamental philosophical debates about what is the connection between reason and freedom that were sort of put aside or swept under the carpet for 60 years by traditional late 20th century conservatism.
Right. Well, based on my personal experiences, because I mentioned I do have conservative friends through Facebook and so forth, they talk about, much like some socialists do, and I've drawn these comparisons. They don't like, these invidious comparisons, and they may think it's just superficial, and maybe it is in a way, but they talk about true liberty. Economic freedom, like socialists will talk about economic freedom, the freedom of the capitalist entrepreneur to walk away with all of his profits and disregard, the workers, allegedly. For them, that's not true freedom, economic freedom. And the conservatives are of a similar mindset, I think. So they do talk about true liberty. So in some cases, I don't think they do abandon liberty. They're not necessarily coming out of the closet to advertise their, I don't want to say totalitarian aims, but their national conservative aims. We'll just leave it at that. But
I would say it's authoritarian in its general tendency, yeah.
Perhaps, yes. So I'm just making the point that sometimes they'll just claim that they're seeking true liberty, through the exercise of virtue. Because if you're just say, this goes back to the materialism aspect. As much as libertarians and classical liberals talk about the prosperity that capitalism has brought to basically all of us, at least in the West, for conservatives, they feel that is in some ways a terrible distraction, and more than a distraction, almost an evil, because it's like this vortex that draws people away from things that should be considered more important, more virtuous, like the family. So you'll have these young men, rather than seeking marriage, they're playing video games online, or they're watching Netflix, and they're not reading anything of substance, and they're just caught up in this worship of pop culture, essentially, and their heroes are pop culture icons rather than, say, war heroes, or it's rock stars now. These are their heroes and so forth. So there's that constant harping on materialism, and so I feel that sometimes classical liberals are at a disadvantage in a sense, because we can see some of this rot, and sometimes it's embarrassing. And this is what Patrick Deneen has seized upon, that all this cornucopia of sorts has pulled people into this vortex of materialism, and some of that includes drugs, and therefore his claim is that the welfare state has been brought into being, in a sense, to address some of these problems created by too much abundance, in a sense. And so how do you respond to that?
Well, that's ahistorical, because the welfare state, the welfare state was called into place. I think it was actually called into being by abundance in a different sense, in that prior to the early 20th century, nobody could ever have conceived of a welfare state because there wasn't enough money to redistribute, right? You could tax the rich as much as you like. You weren't going to be able to provide everybody with a living. It was because the welfare state, and I think there's actually sort of a lag here, because the welfare state provided everybody with such a high standard of living that it became conceivable that by taxing just a little bit, you could, the number of people who were well off and the number became much larger, the number of people who were poor became much smaller. At that point, it became conceivable as a practical idea that you could actually tax the well-off people just a little bit and provide a basic income for the not so well-off people. But on the other hand, the welfare state, if you look at it, was actually put into place before the kind of mass consumer prosperity that these nationalist conservatives are talking about. It was, I remember it was all in place by the 1970s, and we didn't have video games. We didn't have a lot of the things they're complaining about as the sybaritic luxuries that we enjoy. But I want to back up a little bit to which question or premise there, which is that if they're so concerned about spiritual things, notice this is an old point that Ayn Rand made way back in I think the late 50s or early 60s about conservatives versus liberals. She says, notice that each side wants to control the part of life that regards as most important. So a bunch of the leftists are materialists. I mean, the literal materialists in the sort of Marxist sense. They're materialists, and so they want to control everything in the material world. They want to control all of economics. And where they want freedom is the part of the part that they think is irrelevant. You know, you get a freedom of thought, but we think thinking is irrelevant. It's all material. That's an old Marxist idea. And then you have the conservatives who say, no, the spiritual part of life is more important. The material part of life is less important. Therefore, we're going to let the material life be free, and we're going to control everything in the spiritual realm. And I think that's sort of an idea that's now coming back to the forefront as the primary idea of these national conservatives. And so the thing is, if they think spiritual life is so important, why is it that they then want that to be subject to the most material force of all, which is coercion and the state? You know, so there's that contradiction of trying to pretend that they think that spiritual life is important, while at the same time then making it a realm of coercion and obedience, and making it something that's imposed on people from without their internal conviction. You know, forgetting everything that Locke and the founding fathers said about how only the inner light and evidence and reason can convince somebody of an idea or of a religious idea. I just one of the things I did when writing about the Enlightenment is another friend of mine named Pat Mullins has written a book about a guy named Jonathan Mayhew, sort of a forgotten founding father, extremely influential Boston preacher in the years leading up to the American Revolution. Now, he died young and never made it to the American Revolution, which is why he's forgotten. But he had a huge impact on people like John Adams and a bunch of the other revolutionaries in the Boston area. And his big thing was talking about the right of private judgment in matters of religion. And that was his big crusade, that God gave us reason, he intended us to use it, and therefore we have a right to make our own decisions and to have religious freedom. He was a crusader for religious freedom. And this was at a time when his sort of high point was something called the First Bishop Controversy, where the Parliament was considering imposing an Anglican bishop on the colonies. And of course, Boston was full of all these dissenters and nonconformists and all these people who had come to America specifically to escape the control of the Anglican Church, and they were afraid that Parliament was going to try to reimpose that. And the interesting thing is that in fighting against that idea, they rehearsed a whole bunch of the ideas about the power of Parliament over the colonies, about individual rights, a whole bunch of the ideas that would become central to the American Revolution. They were all talking about this like 15 years earlier with this First Bishop Controversy. So this idea that this sort of Lockean idea of that reason and evidence should be the basis for and personal conviction, uncoerced personal conviction should be the basis of religion. That is one of the founding ideas of the American system, and so America, I would say, takes spiritual ideas in its founding version. America took spiritual ideas and the spiritual aspect of life far more seriously because it regarded it as something that therefore has to be free and uncoerced. Now, if you look at this, and I've been taking apart what they mean by their attacks on individual autonomy, because individual autonomy, if you think of what the autonomy means, it is true freedom, if you want to talk about it that way. And that autonomy, if you break down the Greek roots, it means basically self-rule or giving law to yourself, right? So autonomy is not acting on whim without any self-control. Autonomy is self-control. And so if you were looking to encourage autonomy, you would be encouraging people to use their freedom, to learn how to use their freedom, to learn how to make decisions and make choices. And so if they were for true freedom, you would think they'd actually embrace autonomy and be teaching, we need to understand what autonomy really it is. It really means self-control. But if you look into what they think is the answer to what true freedom is, what they basically, their model is, you will go to Sunday school for every week, every Sunday for your entire life from the time you're a kid, and you'll be so trained in obedience to tradition that will be so obedience will be so drummed into you, will be so automated that the weight of tradition and authority in your life psychologically will be so powerful that you will never dare step out of line for the rest of your life. So they don't really have a concept of, their concept of true freedom is an ingrained habitual obedience to authority. And if you really unpack what they have to say, that's what it all comes down to. So true freedom is, again, freedom is such a foundational, central value of human life that very few people will come out. Everybody has to feel that they have some claim to it, to say, well, no, I'm not really against freedom. I'm just for true freedom, which happens to be, the way I define it. But if you look at what they mean by true freedom, it usually means something that's the opposite of freedom. It usually means embracing my role as a cell in this larger collective that is obedient to its control. And that's really what they mean, is that you will be, the weight of authority and tradition will be so great in society, it will be pressing down on you from above for your whole life in such a fine and detailed way that therefore you will follow that rule and never dare to step out of line for the rest of your life. Now, I would also point out that recent history kind of disproves that, because they sort of go back to this idea that things were great in the 1950s when you still had prayer in schools, you still had some sort of vague government support for religion. You didn't have all these liberal judges coming along and getting rid of all those things. But the thing is, the 1950s led to the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. And if religion were so self-perpetuating as they tend to think it is, if religious authority being central in the culture were so self-perpetuating, it would have perpetuated itself. The evidence indicates that it didn't. And I think that what they're really terrified of is that if people are left free to use reason and to think for themselves, they won't choose religion, that they'll drift away. They're afraid of the fact that religion has no way to rationally argue for itself or recommend itself, and that without the government there to coercively impose it on people, people will choose to reject it.
They might say that that's a point in their favor, in a sense, because they often talk about the corruptibility of human nature. So liberalism, and again, for them, they don't care. They'll make distinctions for you. They'll recognize distinctions. But for them, progressivism, libertarianism, socialism, et cetera, it all goes in the same box. Or it's coming, I should say.
The thing is, they may take that as a point in their favor, but it really isn't when you think about it. Because what they're basically saying is, we have a viewpoint that cannot survive on its own. A viewpoint that can, and if you look back at Thomas Jefferson, somebody like Thomas Jefferson, who said, by the way, when they talk about the founding fathers, they really love to talk about Adams. They'll talk about Hamilton. They like Hamilton because he was kind of a nationalist, kind of a big government guy. They'll sort of airbrush Thomas Jefferson out. The article you sent me to from Yoram Hosoni, one of the ones he wrote, talks about how he goes straight to Acts as 1787 is the founding of America, because that's the Constitution was written. The Declaration of Independence doesn't exist in his worldview, because if he recognized that, he'd have to recognize that basically America was founded on Lockean principles. So they tend to write Jefferson out, and Jefferson's the one who said, truth doesn't need coercion. The truth can survive if it's allowed just simply to compete. All it needs is the ability to compete and to be heard, and truth and reason can win through. And I think they're terrified of the fact that if we have a marketplace of ideas, I think they're terrified of the fact that it's actually happening, that their viewpoint has not enough foundation, not enough appeal on the basis of facts and logic and evidence, on the basis of arguing to free, uncoerced people, that has so little appeal they're going to lose the argument. Well, admitting that, hey, when allowed to make an argument we're going to lose, is really admitting the weakness of your viewpoint. It's admitting that your viewpoint can't survive. Saying that viewpoint can't survive unless people are coerced is a way of basically saying my views are so false people will not accept them.
Right, but the point I wanted to make, again, of course I'm playing devil's advocate here. They are, in a sense, paternalistic. They'll make a distinction between those who can govern themselves the philosophers and the rabble, the proletariat, whatever you want to call them. And they're basically saying that liberalism is like a Pandora's box for the average person. That when we throw out these temptations, that the average person is not going to choose a virtue. He's going to become distracted by materialism. So it's not really a fair fight when you consider the nature, when you consider human nature. So even though they might admit, say, they're paternalistic, maybe they would admit that they will lose the argument, so to speak, because look who they're losing it to, in a sense. If we're talking about the mob, and the mob doesn't accept your arguments, it's simply because they're not philosophically inclined. They're more interested in materialism, and they will be steered onto the wrong path. And one other point I'd like to make, and then maybe Timo wants to pick it up, but I think many conservatives cannot stand the idea that Christianity is just a lifestyle, that liberalism relegates it to a lifestyle choice, in a sense. And in fact, many Christians who aren't particularly in your face, they're often very, very lovely people. I mean, you can always find, radical Christians who are in your face, but they will often say, you have to come to Christ on your own. And that is, in a sense, you must choose this lifestyle on your own. And I think a lot of perhaps nationalist conservatives, they just don't like that idea. We need some sort of foundation. Christianity probably should be that foundation because that has the historical, the traditional aspects are already there. And so we need to get people on the right path. And if, you're a philosopher king, that's fine. You want to be an atheist, but there's so few of those, we don't really need to worry about them. They're not going to set us on the wrong path unless they're liberals. Is that even coherent?
Well, I think you're representing their views well. The thing about it is this: is that I'm not one of these atheists who's has a chip on my shoulder against religious people, because again, there's some very lovely religious people out there. I mean, I always think of my grandparents who were pillars of their Methodist church in rural Ohio, and some of the best people I've known. But it came from this idea that we need religion in order to have morality. And I think what the nationalist conservatives are really terrified of is the possibility that we can have morality without religion. That if we don't have religion, because their viewpoint has always been, if we don't have religion, then it's Lord of the Flies. If God is dead, all things are permitted. I think it was Dostoevsky who said that. So it's this idea that without religion, it's chaos. It's people eating each other in the streets. Civilization is going to collapse. And what we have right now in real time, in our lifetimes, is this vast experiment where the vast majority of people turn away from any kind of strict religious belief. There are a lot of people who still say they're Christians, but they go to church twice a year. They're not. It doesn't have this central role in their lives. A large number of our fellow citizens are turning away from religion. And at the same time, crime is down. And this is sort of the Steven Pinker. This is why Steven Pinker is sort of somebody who takes up a lot of space in their heads, because he's the one pointing to the evidence that, I recommend this book. I have disagreements with the book. He's sort of somebody who takes the Enlightenment and finds that it's totally, all the ideas of the Enlightenment of the 18th century philosophers are totally consistent with conventional late 20th century liberalism. And I was like, well, no, it's a very selective view of it. But what he's good at is looking at these statistics, and he bombs you with this book, Enlightenment Now. He absolutely just carpet bombs you with facts and figures and statistics and charts and graphs, and I'm a sucker for charts and graphs, showing you how much life has improved. And the thing about it that I found fascinating is it's not just material improvement. He also looks at things like things that would be measures of moral and spiritual well-being. Now, moral and spiritual well-being is a hard thing to measure directly, but there's lots of things you can measure indirectly. So violence is down. If we're talking about morality, the most immoral thing you can do is to go up and punch somebody in the face, or to kill somebody, or that's a a gauge of a society that's less violent, a society that with less crime is a more moral society, a more self-controlled society. Crime is way down, both historically and since the crime wave of the 60s and 70s. Education is up. Access to culture has improved. It even shows figures showing that in countries the more developed countries, average IQ is up 10 points just from being wealthier and healthier. Your IQ and more educated, you become more intelligent. Your brain expands. So in a lot of measures, and now they talk about, but what about the family? Well, that's the decline of the family sort of has leveled off, and that isn't cratering quite as much. If you look at a lot of the different measures, this catastrophism. So if you read, and this is one of the things that really struck me reading Patrick Deneen, he starts his whole book with basically saying it's obvious to everybody that we're in total crisis and the current liberal order is collapsing. Well, it's not obvious. It's sort of like the appeal to, well, this is just obvious to everybody. Well, maybe it's obvious to everybody in his little circle because they're all Catholics and they're despairing over the collapse of the church. But the fact is that I think what they're really afraid of is that religion is disappearing and the world isn't collapsing into barbarism. Religion is disappearing and people are finding ways to be moral without religious belief, and that it is possible to be moral without religious belief and have a moral society. And I think that, for all the imperfections that we have, and I think we have a long way to go before we figure out, a secular morality. Now, I argue in my book that Ayn Rand, I talk about how Ayn Rand has developed the basis for a philosophical basis for a secular basis for morality. I think that it's something that is not well understood on the philosophical level right now because she's still someone who's considered an outre figure. But I think people are sort of figuring out on the common sense level that the value of living in an orderly, productive, nonviolent life and respecting the rights of others and all of that is something you can do without having to believe in God. And I think the terror that drives the illiberal conservatives is the refusal to believe they don't want to believe that that's possible. Because if that's possible, then where does that leave them? It leaves traditional religious belief and out in the cold. And that's one thing you have to understand too, is that when you talk to these people, there's a certain amount of bad faith to it, because they'll say that, I want an orderly, peaceful, free society in which we don't have chaos and people aren't killing each other. That's what I want, and therefore I'm led back to the necessity of religion. Most of them start with their conversion to religion, which they did for a totally internal spiritual rationale behind it. And then they go out and search for reasons to say, and therefore it's a catastrophe if the rest of you don't also believe this. But they're trying to prop up what is their own internal kind of subjective belief. That's the other thing I find interesting, is the subjectivism of all this, because Hazony talks about how, he's a nationalist. So he's not advocating a universal idea. He says, the ideal is going to be different for every society based on their own traditions. So there's a subjectivism to it. It's like, if the Russians want to have Putin and the Orthodox Church, that's fine. And then we're going to have an American version, which isn't really an American version. It's his fantasy of an American version. Because he wants to have an American version. Wants us to have an American version that throws out Locke and Jefferson and most of at least half of the founding fathers and a fair bit of our history. But it's this fantasy version of the American version, and there's this internal subjectivity to their outlook, because basically it's driven by, I internally subjectively want to believe in religion, and then I go casting about for reasons why that has to be an important part of life and why the world can't get by without it.
Right. I think there are a number of atheist conservatives as well.
There's a small number. I interviewed a couple. The guy at National Review, Charles Cook at National Review, and George Will has long been mentioned as one, but he's so much of a hardcore classical liberal and very much and has become more so as he gets older. So he's very much going the opposite direction from the nationalist conservatives.
Right. Timo, did you have some questions?
I have a number of things I'm curious about. you mentioned Mill's discussion of oppression by disapproval.
Mm-hmm.
And right now, leftists are generally using that idea to oppress people. That is, they feel, that's what they're doing. And the nationalist conservatives you're talking about seem to yearn to do the same thing, though they often object, at least conservatives generally, and then certainly the libertarian conservatives, object to the lack of free speech from the left.
It's the old free speech for me, but not for thee. And it comes from the fact that if you define freedom without the concept of universal human rights, individual rights. If you define freedom in any other way than universal individual rights, you end up with creating some mechanism in which your quote unquote freedom, you might even call it your true freedom, involves the necessity of coercing somebody else. So you always end up pitting people against each other. That in order for me to have freedom, I need to oppress you. And that's like the number one sign that you've made a fundamental philosophical error when you have a concept of freedom so incoherent that it cannot be universally applied to everybody. And that's why, and it's also unnecessary too, because we've had for so long, we have a 200-300 year tradition of this concept of individual rights that sorts that out and sort of defines how, my freedom doesn't need to become at the expense of the freedom of another person. But again, that's what I find fascinating about this sometimes, is that it's a problem so thoroughly solved in a way historically, but the solution doesn't get for people what they really wanted. They don't really want freedom. They want to talk about freedom because they find that to be a useful rhetorical tool, but they don't really want freedom. What they want is for their subjective their subjective religious beliefs or their subjective social loyalties. In the case of the woke left, their subjective social loyalties, they want that to be universally imposed on everybody. That's what they really want. But what they want is that sense of power of my right views. I am so full of my righteousness and the rightness of my views that therefore I should be able to dictate to everybody. And oftentimes you'll find out that when you look at the arguments, the objection that they have against any particular version of freedom is, well, freedom's all great, but it doesn't allow me to impose my ideal of the good society on everybody else. And that's how horrible that I can't do that. But the thing is that, one of the values of freedom, one of the reasons it has prospered and spread across the world as much as it has. You consider 200 years ago, if you talk about free societies that had protections of individual rights and freedom, you're talking about the United States, kind of Britain, which had where we got those ideas, a handful of other places, and everything else was some form of authoritarian system with rule by kings and the church, divided up in some way. Since then, it has expanded tremendously, and one of the reasons it's expanded is the huge value it offers of being able to have a harmonious society where one group, in order to be free or to flourish or to pursue their values, does not have to do so by pitting themselves and going to war with everybody else.
Now, one thing we haven't talked about this whole discussion, which I thought was going to be the focus, and that is the question of reason. And the word reason. I was
just coming to that.
And so, what are your thoughts on reason? That's an open-ended question. The other way of putting it would be, conservatives, especially traditionalist conservatives, downplay reason in sometimes what to me seems weird ways, but I think maybe you understand it better than I do.
And they have to, because what is it? Immanuel Kant said in the preface of the Critique of Pure Reason, I found it necessary to deny reason in order to make room for faith. By the way, that's one of the reasons why when we talk about the Enlightenment and people say, oh, well, the Immanuel Kant was part of the Enlightenment. Chronologically, yes, but he was also somebody who really undermined the Enlightenment because he's the one who brought up this idea, who sort of pioneered this idea of denying reason in order to make room for faith. And that's what they have to do because, again, what drives their outlook, and that's why I find the nationalists so interesting, is that there's been this long period of time where we have this idea that among conservatives that, well, we're for freedom and we're for religion and we're for both, and they work together. And now we're getting a sense of, well, what really drives it? And the nationalist conservatives are coming out saying, no, what really drives it is religion. Religion is our fundamental commitment, and that overrides everything else, including freedom. And because that's their first and primary commitment, they have to, in some way, downgrade or disparage reason and make it seem like it is not capable of being a source of any kind of answers. And I think they're also helped by this in the fact that you had for a while, especially in the 20th century, that the supposedly scientific secular left was peddling a lot of things that were totally irrational. I mean, the what was it? The New York, and to this day, it still has an impact. You see, the New York Times had a couple years ago had a series of articles. I hate to put it this way, but celebrating the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution and trying to rehabilitate communism, right? And so it led me to think about how the pose of communism being a scientific system, and they used to talk about having experiments, the Soviet experiment. Well, in science, when you have an experiment and it fails, you recognize that your theory was wrong and you come up with a new one. And Soviet Union, communism and socialism are these things where you have one experiment after another. They always fail, and you keep going back to it for 100 years. And that gives the lie to the idea of the secular left as being pro-reason. Now, if you actually look at it philosophically, the background, a lot of the secular left actually comes out of the sort of 19th century romanticist backlash against reason. So they sort of stole, in the same way that the left stole liberalism and freedom as their viewpoint, while then advocating huge numbers of controls over people's lives. They also stole the idea of reason as basically meaning anything that isn't traditional religion. And therefore, since our view isn't traditional religion that's rational, but they didn't really, if you look at it philosophically, they were not really that committed to what you would actually recognize as a rational worldview. And I think Marxism was the ultimate example of this, because Marx didn't believe in the mind or thinking as such. He actually, one of the famous things he says is that everything's determined by your economic relationships, by your role in the economic system. That's the underlying reality, and anything going on in your head, ideas, science, any of that is just it's the superstructure. It's this illusion of something going on that's important, but it's not really important. It's just a reflection of the underlying reality. And that's how you got the totalitarian system of communism, which is that you may think you have an idea in your head that it's okay to coerce people to control what ideas are in their head, because their ideas aren't really their own. They're just products of the underlying social system. And that's how you get this idea that, logic is a bourgeois creation. And you find full flower of that in the sort of underlying Marxism of today's left, where you'll see here that, appeals to reason and logic are really just representing the racial power structure underneath everything. So the left, for a long time, the left has been anti-reason. The thing is, it's sort of like there's more than one way to be anti-reason. You can be anti-reason by being religious. You can be anti-reason by having some kind of secular dogma, such as Marxism or the woke race, class, and gender variation of Marxism that we have today. And so it's again this thing. We see this thing where they say, they create a false alternative where it's like either you have our nationalist collectivism or you have this socialist collectivism, and they pretend that individualism doesn't exist or isn't possible as an option. They have this idea you can have religious faith, or you can have this pseudo rationality, the pseudoscientific Marxism, or pseudoscientific secular left of the 20th century, and ignore the rationality of the Enlightenment, which is still alive and well and having a big impact, but doesn't have the philosophical defenders, and I think that's what it needs.
Now, in our tradition, the real liberals, Hayek and others, Herbert Spencer before him, made a big attack upon those who abuse reason to get to socialism, basically, or to get to some sort of technocracy. But both Hayek and Spencer and others in the liberal tradition have had a keen appreciation for the limitations of reason in everyday life. And do you have any thoughts on that? Because I know Ayn Rand is not known for her nuanced views on that, I don't think.
Well, I think limitations on reason is a bit of equivocation when the way Hayek uses it, because he's basically saying that the limitation of reason is it doesn't provide omniscience to. If the limitation of reason is that it doesn't provide omniscience to the regulator, well, of course it doesn't. There's a long philosophical thing, and Ayn Rand used to harp on this, and I think it's a really valid objection, which says people judge reason by the standards of faith. That by the standard of faith, knowledge has to be automatic, and it has to be omniscient, it has to be infallibly right, and you have to be able to have this. Jesus hits you with a blinding light, and you see the truth. Right? That's their model for what would be efficacious. Well, reason doesn't work that way, but that's an irrational standard to hold it to. That's a totally false standard to hold it to. Reason means you have evidence and you make conclusions based on the logically make conclusions based on the evidence. It means you're not going to arrive at the truth all at once. It's not going to be a revelation that gives you omniscience. So the old fantasy that you're going to have the gray little bureaucrat at his desk in a windowless room in Washington, D.C., who's going to be controlling the entire economy, that was a fantasy of reason. It wasn't based on an actual appreciation of how reason really works. I think there was a sort of, and the one appeal it had to the educated classes was what I call engineer's hubris, right?
Right.
That if you've ever argued with an engineer, there's a certain number of people who will say, well, look, I've been trained in engineering. I know facts. I know numbers. Therefore, I am omnicompetent at solving every question. And this sort of runs into what they call the Dunning-Kruger effect, where you might be an expert in your own field and you underestimate how much knowledge you need of other fields to be able to say something intelligent about that's going to be more accurate than throwing darts at a dartboard. So there's this sort of hubris of I know something in this one field, therefore people like me should be deciding every question in every field. The thing is that rationality means taking into account all of the facts, and taking into account not just the knowledge you have, but how you get that knowledge and how knowledge is gained and the limitations of your knowledge. Now, recognizing the limitations of your knowledge is not the same thing as recognizing the limitations of reason. Right, so reason has proven its effectiveness at gaining lots more knowledge. Right, so reason is not so much limited, but reason also, adhering to reason also means acknowledging the limits of your knowledge at any one specific point in time. So, acknowledging the limits of your knowledge at one point in time doesn't mean acknowledging the limits of your ability to gain knowledge at some point in the future as you continue on. We know a lot more about the workings of the physical world. I think we know a lot more about psychology and how to organize a society than people did a couple hundred years ago, certainly than people did 500 years ago, a lot more than they knew 2,000 years ago. Knowledge increases over time, but it takes time for that to happen. So reason is, I wouldn't say reason is limited, but what I'd say is that reason is a process. It's a process that produces knowledge, and rationally you have to respect that process.
Conservatives tend to harp on something that they call abstract reason, and it seems that they think that liberals, and that could be libertarians or just progressives, it doesn't matter, they want to look at everything through the lens of reason and see if any particular institution or tradition can be justified, whatever that would mean, by reason alone. And then if it can't be, we have to get rid of it. And then when you follow that approach, there's a slippery slope built in, it seems that they're saying. So 1 minute you're talking about X and Y chromosomes, and the next minute you're talking about 57 genders. And they think that reason just opens the door to all of that kind of nonsense because it's built on that abstract approach, and that because tradition naturally dissolves in the acid bath of reason, whatever metaphor you want to use, there's no way to stop it. But that seems incorrect to my way of thinking. I mean, every reason to my way of thinking is like that expression about the man who was speaking prose and didn't know it. I mean, it's the operating system in the human, one of the, the operating systems in the human mind. everyone reasons. The question is, what do you do with it? If you make reason your God, that's different than reasoning in and of itself, it seems. And I feel like conservatives have conflated those two things where, their paradigmatic example is the Russian Revolution would be another one, but, the French Revolution and especially with regard to Edmund Burke's view of the French Revolution. And so when you make reason your God, you're going to end up in that violent cul-de-sac no matter what, or you end up with 57 genders. Do you think they're conflating something there?
It's a very big philosophical issue that they're skating over, or they're using in a tendentious way. And that is that one of the things we keep coming back to is they want to pretend John Locke never existed, because what they want to say is reason is not. So John Locke represents one view of reason that's as opposed to the view of reason that they put forward, which is basically, I guess Descartes would be the great example, because we're talking about the French Revolution. Let's talk about Descartes, a French philosopher. And they tend to think that reason means reasoning from first principles, logically deducing things from self-evident first principles. And that was Descartes' approach. And the Descartes' approach was the first thing you do to understand anything is you look inward to your concept, and you intuit what is in your concept of a thing, and then you deduce everything from that. Well, obviously, John Locke famously was an empiricist. He said, no, you look outward. And this is an old philosophical debate. Before it was Descartes versus Locke, it was Plato versus Aristotle. If you've ever seen the famous Raphael painting, it's in the Vatican, actually, the School of Athens. It shows all these great Greek philosophers and astronomers and mathematicians, and in the center is Aristotle and Plato is gesturing upward, saying, look to the heavens, look to this realm of pure forms, which are literally disembodied abstractions. And Aristotle is gesturing outward. If you go to this side so you can see it. He's gesturing outward, saying, look at the world, base everything on observation. And that's these are two fundamentally different views of reason that go all the way back to the foundations of Western civilization, to when we first started talking about the issue of reason. And the conservatives love to grasp onto the sort of Platonic view of reason and say, reason is deducing from these abstract first principles and following those deductions wherever they go, even if they contradict what the observed facts are, even if you end up with 57 genders. If you come up with, and even if you come up with, failed experiments in socialism that keep failing over and over again, no, you stick to the concept that you had and you deduce from the concepts and you never look at reality. That's why they try to create that as a sort of a straw man of what reason is, and ignoring the more empirical view of reason. So that's an old philosophical issue that they're sort of ignoring and presenting in a one-sided way. Because if you looked at reason as observation of the world and then inducing ideas, developing ideas from out of the evidence of observation, you wouldn't end up with a lot of these ridiculous things that are attributed to worshiping reason, because you would recognize that this contradicts the observable facts. So we tried, we tried collectivizing the farms and people starved. You would actually have that feedback of, I came up with this idea, I tried it in reality, the observed facts show that it was wrong, therefore I have to revise the idea. That's what reason is. Sticking to an abstract principle no matter what is not what reason is. But like I said, it's like what I said earlier about judging reason by the standards of faith. They like that idea of reason because it makes it almost a competing version of faith. Right, where you start with something that you intuit from the realm of pure forms by literally a process of revelation. Plato called it recollection, but it's basically a literal process of revelation. You have an insight coming to you from another world, and then all of your chain of reasoning follows from that. They want to make it like a bunch of people sitting around in the scholastic philosophers. Starting with religious first principles and debating how many angels can stand on the head of a pin. They want to make that into their template for what reason is, because it then becomes just another competing version of religion. and a lesser, an inferior version of religion. So why not go back to the original item?
Very good. I think we have reached a limit on time. We're over an hour, well over an hour, and that's great. It's been great talking to you. And we also reached, I'm afraid, a limit on Skype. So let's not hope too much for Skype today, but I'll try to have this up by the end of the week. So you'll get a chance of that.
Thank you so much, Robert.
Thanks for having me on. I liked it.
This has been great. Thanks a lot.
Take care.